Hello, in today's video, I'm going to be replacing this brake master cylinder on this 2001 Honda Odyssey. This procedure is pretty similar to most any car or truck brake master cylinder replacement. The reason we are replacing this brake master cylinder is due to the fact that it's begun failing and almost hits the floor, barely stopping the vehicle. Even though it's only happened a few times, it's not something you want to ignore. Some things to note: we know it's not due to an adjustment problem since the brake pedal height is fine every other time. As you may be able to notice, if the brake pedal were to hit the floor every time I was to press the pedal, then I would check the adjustment before replacing it. Then we'd also want to check the brake fluid level, which the level in our case is fine and hasn't dropped. Nor do we have any signs of brake fluid leaks anywhere. Another sign that the master cylinder may need replacing is it'll begin to leak past the seal in the back of the master cylinder, which is usually noticeable with fluid leaking around here, but this one's dry, so not an issue in this case. Well, let's go ahead and get started with the replacement of this master cylinder. First thing I'm going to do is remove the intake tube so we can have more room to work. We'll separate the attached hoses from the guides on the tube and any cable guides. Pulling the smaller tube back far enough to be able to move it out of the way. Followed by disconnecting this hose. Now, using a Phillips head screwdriver, let's loosen the clamp attaching it to the throttle body. With that same screwdriver, we can loosen the screws to the airbox lid. There will be 4 of them. With those loose, we should be able to pull the airbox lid off, just like so. Before pulling off the intake tube, just want to make sure everything is disconnected, like these wires that are still inside this guide. And now we should be able to pull off the intake tube. With that removed, it gives us so much more room to work with. Here we got the replacement brake master cylinder that I'll be installing. Before removing the old one, you'll want to make sure it matches, which this one does. I also like to use this master cylinder bleeder kit, which we'll be using to bench bleed the new master cylinder before installation. This kit helps us bleed out the air inside the master cylinder, so when it's installed, all we have left to do is remove any air that gets trapped inside the brake lines. With all the parts in hand, we're ready to loosen these brake line nuts. I prefer using flare nut wrenches on them, which in this case is a 12mm. They're better to avoid rounding out the corners since it grabs more of the nut than a typical wrench. What I do is loosen them counterclockwise and then I snug them back up. That way they don't begin to leak just yet, but they're loose enough to make them easy to loosen when I'm ready. Now that those brake lines are loose, I'll put something to absorb any brake fluid that may drip once I begin to remove them. Using a 13mm deep socket with a 6-inch extension, I'm going to loosen and remove the 2 nuts holding the brake master cylinder. With both of those removed, I'll go ahead and remove the brake lines, which should now loosen easily. Once we break them loose, we might just be able to rotate them off by hand. We should be able to do the same on this next one as well. It may help to use something like a turkey baster to get as much brake fluid out of the reservoir as you can. Unfortunately, you can't get it all, so some will spill. Once they're off, we can pull the lines back and down so they're out of the way while we pull off the master cylinder. You do want to make sure to wear safety glasses and avoid getting any brake fluid on your vehicle's paint because it can act like a paint thinner if it does. So if you do, make sure you get it off right away. What I should have done is disconnected the wires to the cap before pulling off the master cylinder, which here I removed the cap instead, but without the cap, it ended up just allowing the brake fluid to pour out instead of drip out, making a mess. The cap will have these two wires going to it, which function as a brake level sensor, so we can pull these wires off one by one. As they have a different connection for each wire, they'll only go back in one way. We are now ready to bench bleed the new master cylinder. If you got a vise, I set it up like so. I put blue shop towels between them, just so it doesn't leave vise marks, but it's not necessary. One thing you don't want to do is set it up so it's clamping here in the middle. It'll damage it and can cause problems with the installation or damage the shaft, which may also cause the inner seal to leak. Once it's set up on the vise, we'll locate the adapters that come in the kit, which thread into our master cylinder, just like these. And for this vehicle, we will be using DOT3 brake fluid. Now that we got our fittings installed, we'll want to get the two hoses included in the kit and slide them over the barbed end of the fittings, just like so, removing the cap since we're about to add brake fluid. So we'll grab our brake fluid and fill it up to the full mark. With the brake fluid in, we'll remove the strainer it has by pulling it off and placing it to the side. At this point, we want to let the brake fluid begin to come out of each hose. It shouldn't take long. Once it does, we'll grab the other end and place it into the reservoir, and from this point on, we want the end to stay submerged in the fluid till we complete the bleeding procedure. To hold them and keep them submerged, I use the two retainers that were included in the kit. Once it's set up like this, we are ready to begin. You'll want to use a blunt tool, something like the screwdriver, to push the master cylinder piston, which we can see after removing this yellow cover it has installed. Using the screwdriver, we're going to slowly push the piston inward, no more than an inch each time. As we pump it, the fluid will begin flowing through the lines. You will notice lots of air bubbles at first, but they will slowly go away. So the reason we want the ends of the line submerged in brake fluid is so that it doesn't pull air into the master cylinder as we release the piston. And we will continue this process till we see no air bubbles in the line. It will take some time, about 10 minutes or so. As the air bubbles get less and less, you will notice the piston get firm, and that's what we want to happen till the air is completely gone. Once the master cylinder is bench bled, you can either install it in the vehicle as is with the hoses and fittings, or if you have limited space like I do in this one, you can install it with these block-off plugs that came with the master cylinder. From this point on, you want to make sure that there's fluid in the reservoir the whole time. If it goes empty, you will have to start over. So when installing these block-off plugs, you'll want to install them pretty quick, one by one. For these plugs, you can just snug them up by hand as long as they don't drip, which in my case they didn't. Now for the install. When reinstalling it, you want to center the master cylinder so it goes in straight. I had to push the lines out of the way a bit to get it to line up. Once you get the first part in, you'll want to line it up to the studs from the brake booster. Now that it's lined up, just push it in the rest of the way. With it sitting in place, just install the nut and snug it up for now, followed by the other one. You can snug them up with the ratchet now, or if you wait, it might make it easier to get the brake lines back on. Now to install the brake lines, which we'll do one by one. Remove the block off plug, then we'll line up the brake line. What I do is adjust the line here on the underside to help me line it up as I rotate the nut till it begins to thread in. It's very important to start them by hand to avoid cross-threading the threads. Once you feel it catch, just thread it in as far as you can by hand. With that one started, we continue on to the next one. Once again, remove the block off plug, then line up the line while rotating the nut till the threads catch, then tighten it by hand. Now that they're both hand tight, we can now use the wrench to tighten the line nuts. After snugging them up, I do a final tightening on both. Now for the mounting nuts, we can tighten them, or if you prefer, torque them down to 18 foot-pounds. With everything tightened down, I clean the area, focusing on the area around the threads. This will help me make sure there's no leaks from the lines, as they should stay dry from this point on. If you notice it keeps leaking, or that your finger gets wet, then you'll want to make sure that the line nut is properly tightened down. Now to top off the brake fluid, removing the cap, fill it, then reconnect the two wires going to the cap. In our last video, I showed you how to make a self-bleeding kit for your brakes, so I'll be using that same kit. If you haven't seen it, I'll link it at the end or in the description. To bleed out any remaining air from the brake lines, we want to start at the furthest wheel from the master cylinder, this being the rear passenger. So using an 11mm wrench and the hose on the bleeder valve, I rotate the bleeder valve counterclockwise about 1/5 of a turn. Then from inside, I pump the brake pedal a few times so it pushes the air bubbles out along with the old fluid. After pressing the brake pedal a few times, anywhere between 5 to 10 times, I tighten it back up, closing the valve. If you keep getting air bubbles coming out with the fluid, you'll want to continue this till you don't. Just look at how dirty the old fluid was, and this is mixed with new fluid. This is another reason why we want to do this after replacing the master cylinder. Now continuing on to the rear driver's side. With the valve loosened, I pump the pedal another 5 to 10 times. Afterwards, making sure to close the valve. Followed by the front passenger side, loosening the valve. Pump the pedal about 3 times, being that the fronts push more fluid through with each pump. And then tighten the valve. And finally the front driver's side, loosening the valve. Once again pump the pedal 3 times. And finally tighten the valve. Just a reminder, you do not want to let this brake reservoir go empty when bleeding the brakes, so make sure you're constantly checking the level. Well, let's get this air intake tube back on. Reinstall the tubes, the lines, and the hoses back in their place. Now for the airbox lid. Then we can route all the hoses and cables back in their guides. And finally retighten this clamp. Followed by the screws to the airbox lid. Now let's check and make sure the pedal feels as it should. We should have a high firm pedal, which we do. If you notice a spongy or a sinking pedal, then you still got air somewhere, or a valve or line was left loose. So you'll want to locate the issue and continue bleeding the system till you get no more air bubbles in the line. But in our case, everything is good, feeling noticeably better than with the previous master cylinder. And with that, it completes our brake master cylinder replacement. Well, I hope you were able to find this video helpful and informative. If so, please click that thumbs up button to support my video and my channel, and please subscribe if you haven't done so.